Good morning and welcome. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Hua Ding and colleagues at Fudan for inviting me to this wonderful forum, and it's a great honor to be here. Today's presentation will be based on my book published recently by Palgrave Macmillan. Following the global financial crisis, we got a couple of puzzles. Why were some of the liberal market economies like Australia and Canada and coordinated market economies like Japan operating under the same set of global rules less affected than others such as UK, US, and Germany in the global financial crisis? Were Australian, Canadian, and Japanese bankers, politicians, regulators, and the public in general smarter than their counterparts in Europe, US, and the UK? So these questions have significant implications and pose some challenges to varieties of capitalism literature, which assumes divergent institutional arrangements between coordinated and liberal market economies. If that was the case, in the face of a common external shock like a global financial crisis, we should have expected a similar outcomes in liberal market economies and quite different outcomes in coordinated market economies. But that was not the case. So how are we going to explain divergence within and across these two different types of advanced capitalist economies during the global financial crisis? That's the puzzle that I'm interested in. The key answer to these questions is, financial system resilience is a function of structural and institutional complementarities and agency-level enabling conditions. And if these complementarities and agency-level enabling conditions reinforce a conservative bank behavior, then financial system resilience is most likely. So I will explore this in detail. And my research will focus on Australia, which is examined in a comparative perspective. And why Australian exceptionalism? Well, it has the lowest non-performing loans in the sample, and it has the highest bank provisions to non-performing loans. So this is truly exceptional compared to any other country in OECD. And secondly, when we look at the literature, what we observe is, people focused on what went wrong. So people did not focus on what went right. So we can learn a lot from a positive case as well. These are the key motivations. So. And I would like to briefly refer to my method and theory. This is deviant case study of Australia in a comparative perspective. It is based on primary and secondary resources, and the key resources include interviews with very senior 12 people that I conducted in Sydney and Melbourne. This includes current Reserve Bank of Governor in Australia, two former governors, head of Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, deputy head, and a former head, senior board member at ANZ Bank, former treasurer, and this kind of very senior people. And in this research, I offer structure, institution, and agency-based framework. And I also offer typological theory of bank behavior. So let me get into details of this this research. First of all, I am interested in the interactions between structures, institutions, and agents. I'm interested in both, top-down and bottom-up levels of interactions, and these are the, key constructs that emerged from my research, and the bank behavior can be classified into two typologies: conservative bank behavior and opportunistic bank behavior. Conservative bank behavior basically refers to prudent lending, borrowing, investment, and trading related activities, and opportunistic bank behavior basically refers to the opposite. And you can see, the key constructs that came out from the research. Let me explain, what are those constructs and how they are interrelated. Well, you see structural, institutional, and agency level variables here. And if a particular variable reinforces conservative bank behavior, I give a plus, minus otherwise. And if the sum of the pluses are higher than the sum of the minuses, then at the end of the day, the system, financial system, reinforces conservative bank behavior. So let me start with the macroeconomic structure. Well, saving and investment ratios are extremely important, and if investment ratio is significantly higher than saving ratio, then banks concentrate on productive domestic lending activities. They do not chase risky assets abroad. So banks are more likely to channel savings into productive investments at home when the rate of risk-adjusted return is high in a growing domestic economy. And in regards to market structure, concentration and oligopolistic market structure is important, but the level of competition within that market is to be taken into account. So, as you can see, Australia and the UK has a similar, almost identical level of concentration, but when it comes to competition, well, UK system is much more competitive than the Australian system. So, if the oligopolistic market structure offers significant profit opportunities for domestic banks, then again, banks do not chase risky assets abroad. They focus their activities at home. So throughout my presentation, as you can see, I will refer to some of the quotations that I have, as well as tables. So what is the second lesson? Second lesson is less competitive markets, less competitive banking systems are less fragile. They also constrain excessive risk-taking. Another significant item is the currency structure. If your domestic currency is not a top international currency, then your bankers will have face a significant inhibitor to become a global bank. So if you don't have a global bank, you don't have strong incentives to chase risky assets abroad or chase regulatory arbitrage abroad. So this is the third structural significant factor that contribute to why Australia performed well compared to other countries. I should also note the significance of ideational structure. By ideational structure, I refer to basically the key culture that influence the code of conduct in particular area. For example, if there is a tendency, there is a culture that markets are self-regulatory and efficient, and if that culture is a kind of ideology, then it's really not possible to see your bankers and regulators intervening in in a product in a aggressive and in a preventive, proactive way to prevent bankers from taking excessive risks. Here in Australia, the key issue was the pragmatism rather than ideological commitment to neoliberal paradigms. They basically choose what was working at the time. And this also informed the regulators and regulated firms as well. Here, for example, if you look at the regulation side, Australian banks, in terms of Tier 1 capital, on paper at least, look less regulated than their counterparts in terms of quantity, but the quality matters. And here, most of the Tier 1 capital was kept in the form of retained earnings, whereas this, in the US and UK, Tier 1 capital was kept in the form of preferred stock. So, they have, what I'm trying to say is, Basel II provided enormous discretion to national regulators to interpret the rules, and how these rules are going to be interpreted to a large extent is determined by the prevailing ideas. And Australia had very conservative interpretation of those rules compared to other countries. So that also contributed to the performance of the regulatory performance of Australia. That also applies to monetary policy. There was a asset price bubble in 2003 in Australia, and the Australian central bank governor intervened proactively by raising interest rates. It was very unpopular, and he also delivered open mouth operations, basically warned the public about the risks associated with the mortgage market. So this was also important. They did not subscribe to the idea that asset bubbles should not be pricked, actually, in contrast to UK and US, what Australia did was to prick the bubble, and that was the attempt undertaken by the governor at the time. So these are some of the contributors to the better performance of Australia. And competition policy. Only 2 countries in OECD prevent in-market mergers among the largest banks, and these are Australia and Canada. And these countries also prevent hostile foreign takeovers. This is similar to cross shareholdings and block shareholdings in Japan and Germany, respectively. So this is important because one of the senior person that I interviewed noted that they don't need to chase risky assets in order to boost their price-earning ratio, because they did not face the risk of hostile takeovers. So again, competition policy is very important, and when the competition for corporate control among the largest banks is limited or non-existent, excessive risk-taking driven by short-term market indicators is least likely. In regards to agency level enabling conditions, we should perhaps underline the significance of the dominant business model in banking. You know, in Australia and most of Canada and Japan, especially, we got this retail banking, traditional banking model rather than investment banking model, and that made a big difference in regards to, you know, organizational level preferences adopted by banks. This is also a significant factor explaining why, for example, some of the banks in the US and UK perform better than the others. For example, JP Morgan in the US and Lloyds in the UK, because, you know, these banks were careful in regards to their investment banking arms. At organizational level, they didn't want to get into the transactions which were basically encouraging excessive risk taking through hybrid securities and you know, exotic instruments. So at the end of the day, when we look at the, you know, pluses and minuses related issues with special reference to conservative and opportunistic bank behavior, what we see is, you know, Australia, Canada, and Japan are clear outliers. So what we have here is, you know, minimum divergence within types and maximum divergence across types. You see, you know, the sum of the pluses and minuses in brackets. To conclude, you know, financial system resilience is more likely when structural, institution, and agency level enabling conditions reinforce and or compensate for conservative bank behavior. And you know, regulatory structure is important, regulation is important, but it is just part of the picture. And how regulation interacts with the broader environment and other institutional forces, as well as the, you know, agency level factors matter in bank behavior. And so design of appropriate and effective mix of policy and industrial responses in post-GFC era requires identifying, understanding, and analyzing multiple interdependent variables that affect regulatory and market failures, and how they would be influenced through agency-level responses rather than exclusive focus on macroprudential regulation and or, you know, supervisory and regulatory model. You know, when I was doing this research, I came across with a number of publications from G20 and you know, BIS and International Monetary Fund, and people were discussing what would be the most appropriate regulatory model, and in the end they were suggesting Twin Peaks model of Australia, but you know, that really doesn't make much sense to me, because Twin Peaks model worked well in Australia but not in Netherlands, or single FSA type of model worked well in did not work well in UK but worked well in Japan. So what matters is how, you know, the institutional and structural context affect the implementation of these regulatory models. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.